Well, hello there, listeners. Welcome to this week's episode of the Better Than Vine podcast. I'm your host, Darlene Marshall, and today we're going to be diving into some murky waters around happiness. But first, I want to make sure that you are aware of an offer that is available to listeners of Better Than Vine. If you are someone that wants to help people to make sustainable, positive, lasting change in their life, I strongly encourage you to check out NASM's Certified Wellness Coaching course. Maybe you're a positive psychology practitioner and you want to better understand how lifestyle affects well-being and how to help people build a healthier lifestyle. Or maybe you're a fitness professional and you're starting to recognize that your clients' habits around sleep, around stress, around mindset, their relationships, their emotional well-being, how that impacts their fitness outcomes. Regardless of which category you fall into, Better Than Fine, we want to offer to you a discount code on NASM's Certified Wellness Coach. So if you want more information about the wellness coaching course in general, you can go to nasm.org, click wellness at the top, and there's all kinds of information resources in that drop-down menu. If you do decide that you want to do the course, you can get $600 off whatever the currently discounted price is. So it's a stacking discount using the code Marshall CWC. That's MARSHALLCWC, and use it to check out an additional $600 off. Okay, so let's get to this whole happiness thing. Let's talk about happiness. Because at some point in your life, you've probably just straight up had that thought of, I just really want to be happy. I think it's something that is pretty ubiquitous, right? We all in our culture, in our society, in this moment in time, have that urge, that yearning to be happy. And in my world, in positive psychology, it's typically called the science of happiness, but that's not actually very accurate. There's a lot more that goes into positive psychology than just happiness. And by the end of this episode, my hope is that you're going to have a deeper understanding about why, when we think about wellness, when we think about well being, it's so much more than just happiness. And a lot of today's episode is about why we think what will make us happy isn't actually what makes us happy. And we end up somewhere else. So that mistaken belief, that mismatch in belief, what we think is going to make us happy doesn't actually make us happy. It's a fallacy, right? That's the nature of fallacies. It's a mistaken belief. So through faulty reasoning about happiness, the things that we think will make us happy, it ultimately leads us to being far less happy. And today we're going to look at, well, why is that? And if that's true, then what actually does lead to lasting happiness, which is what we think about when we talk about well-being. So let's take a look at why. So part of the challenge is that happiness itself is pretty vague, right? If you ask people, well, what's happiness? Most people are just going to start listing off the things that they personally like. And that's not really helpful, right? If we think about happiness, it's mostly a state, right? It's kind of like any other emotion, right? I could be a little bit sad. I could be angry. I could be frustrated. And so happiness works the same way, right? It's temporary, it's fleeting. And so if we turn and look at the definition of happiness, I pulled the definition from Oxford Languages, which is what comes up if you Google like definition of yada yada. So Oxford Languages defines it as, quote, the state of being happy, end quote. And every copy editor listening right now just pulled a muscle rolling their eyes because hopefully you remember from elementary school, we don't want to include in the definition of a word that same root word, right? So if we say like, oh, happiness is the state of being happy, that's not very helpful if you don't actually know what it is, right? So it can be very confusing if we're trying to just define happiness because it's temporary, it's vague, it varies from person to person, but it's so ubiquitous, it's in the Declaration of Independence, right? We all know what the yellow smiley face symbol means. So happiness is simultaneously everywhere and kind of meaningless. Now, this question, what is happiness, is a very, very old question. Old enough that Aristotle had these questions. So if we go all the way back to ancient Greece, we can look at what Aristotle had to say on the topic, which is actually what a lot of modern thinking on happiness is based in. So let's take a look at that. Aristotle said there's two kinds of enjoyment or happiness. So hedonic, or hedonism is probably the word that you're familiar with, is short lived pleasures. So, like I said, if you ask people what's happiness and they just start listing off things that they like, they're probably going to start ticking off hedonic pleasure. So, we like our favorite TV shows. We like a good glass of wine. We like going out to dinner, going on vacation, right? Those are short term states of pleasure. That's hedonic. And the other one that Aristotle wrote an awful lot about is eudaimonic, eudaimonia. So, eudaimonic is fulfillment, it's a state of lasting well being, flourishing. So, eudaimonic pleasures are things like meaning, purpose, living out your values, having a positive identity, having thriving relationships. Right? These are all the puzzle pieces that click in together that build lasting fulfillment, which is actually what most people mean when they say they want to be happy. They don't mean they want to feel the way that they felt when they had an ice cream cone as a child, where they're only as happy as long as the ice cream hasn't melted and dropped on the floor. They mean that they want to feel fulfilled and passionate and connected and like they have things in their life that are worth connecting to. But here's the trick. Much of modern life, marketing, apps, culture, they focus on pushing our hedonic pleasures. And those short lived things are actually what we're conditioned to want. Now, the problem here is something called the hedonic treadmill. So, the hedonic treadmill essentially is that we adapt to the experience of pleasure if we experience it regularly. So, you could have that ice cream cone every 3 days and it's no longer special. That's you adapting to the stimulus. So, a really extreme example of this is drug users, right? They need more and more and more to get the fix, to get the high, and eventually they adapt and they're chasing because they've adapted to the drug. I'll give you a less extreme example. Back in 2012, my partner at the time and I went out and we got our very first smartphones. Ooh, we thought it was a big deal at the time. It was a Sunday. We went first thing in the morning so that we'd have the rest of the day to play with our new toys. And we lay down on the couch with our heads at either end, so our feet were kind of meeting in the middle. And both of us just spent the entire day like staring into the abyss of this little glowing rectangle, downloading apps and setting them up. And, ooh, have you tried this one? What about that one? Googling what's the best app for whatever. And long after the sun had gone down, when we both finally came up for air, we looked at each other and we said, some version of, we're really going to need to be careful about this. Because this little glowing screen had sucked our attention for an entire day that we hadn't done any of the other things we wanted to do for ourselves. And we both kind of felt gross. So fast forward 11 years, and now we're learning about all the ways that our phones and our apps have been engineered to exploit our dopamine, literally manufactured to suck our attention into the glowing rectangle and prevent us from going on and doing something else because it's a literal attention economy, right? They're making money off of our dopamine. That gives us a hedonic hormonal hit, but we end up feeling unfulfilled and unable to control that behavior. And then we lose out on the eudaimonic, the fulfillment, the well-being. And this same applies to the new car, the promotion, the fun, exciting new relationship that's actually like a little bit dysfunctional because we're getting the hit of whatever pleasure hormone, depending on the stimulus, but then we adapt to having that new thing. The high comes down and we are chasing the next hit, the next hit, the next hit. So either we keep chasing the rung on the ladder or we find something else that's going to fulfill us in a more meaningful way. You're listening to the Better Than Fine podcast. I'm your host, Darlene Marshall, and we're exploring what really is happiness. If we throw this word around, what do we actually mean? And what will actually help us to find lasting happiness long term? So we got to find something else other than chasing the next rung on the ladder. eudaimonia, purpose, meaning, love, values alignment, positive identity, relationships. That's actually what positive psychology is about. Like, peek behind the curtain. This is really a positive psychology episode. Um, but there is some hedonic stuff in there too. It's fun to go play. It's good to have pleasure and enjoyment. I'm not demonizing that at all. That's got to be in there. But we've also want to have the ingredients to lasting happiness so that there's a balance where we're not just getting sucked into, you know, playing the video game so much that we don't go to work. So let's take this look at lasting happiness, at well-being. It's important to note there's one major theory about happiness and mood that I want you to be aware of as we start diving into these ideas. And this theory is that everyone has a preset range, their own unique preset range, their disposition, and how happy they can get. So, if you think of the happiest, most jubilant, most positive person that you know in the world, it's not necessarily that doing all the right practices are going to make you into that person. These practices are meant to shift you toward the positive end of your own personal range. So it isn't a magic wand to turn everyone into these like superhuman high performer, everyone's so happy. It's building a baseline. And a lot of what we're going to share in this next segment on the show is based in the work of Martin Seligman. He is considered to be like the grand poobah of positive psychology. He would tell you he's not the only founding father. He's just he jokes that he was the mouth, right? He was the one out there proselytizing in a way that got these ideas to the masses. So it's not that he came up with all of it himself, but he's got a quote that I think is really relevant to this idea. And so, quote, "I think you can be depressed and flourish. I think you can have cancer and flourish. I think you can be divorced and flourish. When we believe that happiness is only smiling and good mood, that wasn't very good for people like me, people on the lower half of positive affectivity." End quote. Seligman himself openly recognizes that he's not one of the shining happy people. He's someone who was grumpy and down and had to work really hard to be well. And this is from like the papa of positive psychology. And so it's so important for us to recognize if we're not going to be toxically positive, that that's not the goal to like reinvent yourself into like one of the plastic people. The goal is to bring out your genuine, aligned, authentic well-being and what that looks like for you. So how do we build it? What's it look like to work on eudaimonia, to work on flourishing? It's multi-factor. It's not just one thing. So let's break down the thinking on what actually goes into happiness if we're talking about lasting happiness and not, hedonic treadmill stuff. So let's start with positive emotion because I think that's a really easy one for people to access, to wrap your head around positive emotion. And in the positive psychology world, what we actually look at is people's ratios of positive emotional experience to negative emotional experience. Now, you might already know about negativity bias. Negativity bias is the psychological phenomenon where we're more likely to focus on a negative experience than we are a positive one. So if something bad happens at the same time that like something pretty good's happening, but they're equally kind of, intense, I'm probably going to focus on the negative one. We all know this experience of like doing something you're really proud of, but like there's one person who says something kind of crappy to you and you're going to focus on the crappy comment, right? That's negativity bias. And so when we want to shift the relationship of positive to negative emotion, sure, we can try to avoid the negative, but that's not the same, right? We got to add in some positive in there. We got to do a bit of both. The other thing that you can do is to increase your sensitivity to positive things. And the cool thing is about, this show and kind of wellness work in general is that a lot of the practices in wellness and in fitness actually increase sensitivity to positive experience. And I'll give you an example. There are studies that show that physical activity, exercise or other forms of activity, has been shown to increase the research subjects reporting of how many positive events happened the day, the 24 hours after their workout. So they'd have people go work out or do another physical activity, and then count like how many good things happened that day. Now, people in this study are shown to have more positive experiences after they work out than on the days that they don't. So, did they actually have more positive experiences? Like more nice things happen to them, like out of the virtue of they happen to exercise that day? Probably not. What actually happened is they're more sensitive to a positive emotional experience, right? The valence of their negativity bias shifted. So they're more likely to say, oh, that was positive instead of neutral because they're more sensitive to the good stuff, which I think is super cool, right? It's a way that our lifestyle practice can do things like exercise, being resilient to mental health challenges. That's why that works. It makes you more sensitive to positive experience. So, positive emotion, definitely part of the equation, right? But the absence of the bad isn't the same as the presence of the good. So, we want to go out of our way to seed positive experiences and maybe even change our cognition, our thinking around what is positive. So, the next big factor, how do we spend our time and attention? Where do we put our focus? Are we being intentional in our behaviors? And are our actions aligning with the things that we want and with our values? So, this is also where flow states come in, right? Flow states are a factor of our cognition, our attention. Are we getting absorbed in the tasks that we're doing? Because we know when people are in states of flow and engagement, they tend to be happier. And if you want to dive real deep on that, go check out the episode with Chris Bertram from March. Chris Bertram is the flow expert for Canada's big air sports team. So your half pipe snowboarders, your skiers, right? Like they want to be in a flow state when they're competing. And Chris is the Canadian flow guy. So go check out that episode. The other thing that falls into this category is meditation and mindfulness, because those are practices that improve our attention, our focus, our intentionality, our self regulation. So, if we want to be positively engaged in our life, we want to have attention and focus and control and high executive function. That's a major factor, right? Because now I'm not going to get distracted by the phone. I'm going to be able to choose what I'm engaging in and how I'm spending my time and make sure that that's meaningful and purposeful. So we've got positive emotion, we've got engagement. The next big one, the quality of our relationships. And by and large, if you ask a positive psychology expert, like, what's the one thing, they're going to tell you relationships are the number one factor to lasting happiness. There are studies that show that the happiness of your life partner directly relates to your lasting happiness because it's such a powerful relationship when it comes to our well-being. So who we spend our time with, the quality of those people, do they align with our value system? The quality of the interactions. Do we communicate in ways that strengthen the relationships? Or do we tend to communicate in ways that at best cause languishing, at worst damage the relationship? And then a big part of this is one of those big ideas I want you to take away from this episode. So listen up sharp here. The exchange of meaning and mattering. And it goes like this. All of us want ways that we can contribute to what matters most in our lives and the people that matter most in our lives in meaningful ways. So I want to be able to, like last week, my dad had surgery and I took the day off so I could support him. And that was so meaningful to both of us. And it was a way that he knows how much he matters to me. So I had a meaningful thing I could do, take him to his procedure, and he knew that he mattered. Now, it can't be one way. If the relationship's going to be strong, it's got to go the other way too. So when other people contribute to you in ways that are meaningful to them and meaningful to both of you, that's how you know that you matter. Now, the problem that I see in so many clients and workshop participants and friends and family is a lot of us want to give, but we don't give other people the opportunity to show up for us, right? If we deprive other people of their meaningful contribution, they don't get a chance to feel the payoff of co-supporting. And it's one of the ways that we get the emotional experience of knowing that we matter. I also recently had a small outpatient surgery that left me pretty sick and weak for about 24 hours. And my cousin just shows up at my house. She's got food. She's checking on me. She's like, don't you get off the couch. I would normally never let anyone do that for me. But this is someone who I know I matter so much to. And it was so meaningful for me to let her in. And so that exchange of meaning and mattering, we make meaningful contributions that let other people know they matter. We let them make contributions to us. That's how we know that we matter. Though that is at the heart of a resilient, positive, flourishing relationship. You're listening to the Better Than Fine podcast. I'm your host, Darlene Marshall, and we're talking about happiness and how lasting happiness isn't going to be built just through pleasure. It's built through all of these other things. So we've talked about positive emotion. We've talked about engagement. We've talked about relationships. Now let's talk about the stories that we tell ourselves in our lives. You've probably heard the idea that we all live in a subjective reality. We all live in a world that's being colored by our thinking, our experiences, our interpretations, our moods. And through that subjective lens of our experience, we're going to make up meaning. Right? If all of a sudden someone bursts through the door right here yelling, I'm going to have a reaction that tells me a story. Oh, they're yelling because something is wrong. When really they could be yelling because they're so excited, right? But I'm going to interpret it and tell a story. And that is meaning making. So we make up stories about what's happening right now in the reality that we're experiencing. We make up stories about the arc of our life, right? You've probably heard me tell lots of stories on this show. Many of those stories are me making meaning out of what has happened in the arc of my life, my client's life, my family's life. Maybe you've had trauma and the triggers that are left by that trauma, where you're reliving it, you're making meaning as you are upregulated by whatever's happened. So this is also all of the how we make, find, and build meaning have a direct impact on our well-being. And we can have practices that help us to make positive meaning out of our experiences. And then that positive narrative helps to build well being, because through that meaning making, we find our values, we contribute to our relationships, we know how to live out our lives in alignment with our authentic selves. So, how do we change our meaning making? Well, it starts first with mindfulness, right? Journaling activities, meditation, self reflective exercise, therapy. Therapy is a big one because that helps us to notice the way that we write the story and maybe the times that we're inaccurate, what we would call a cognitive distortion. We can learn to write the script differently in a way that actually helps us build well being. And the other part of this that I think is really important is something that I refer to as self possession. And I think it's best summed up with a quote from Hamilton. I am the one thing in life I can control. So it's this idea that I've got to have control of myself and my mind to recognize the meaning making that I'm doing and start to curve it in a way that's going to help me be well. And I also want to be very clear. The social determinants of our lives, our circumstance, they play a massive role in our outcomes. But I'm also a strong believer in this idea that who we are is not our fault, but it is our responsibility, right? Like we didn't create the circumstances of our upbringing or our trauma, the things that brought us to where we are right now, but we're also the only ones that can take control of what we're going to do going forward, right? Who you are is not your fault, but it is your responsibility. And you are the one thing in your life that you actually can control. So we've got positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning. Now let's talk about accomplishment. This is not just having goals, but having goals that are something known as self-concordant. So self-concordance is when the goals that we're setting, the efforts that we're making, they align with that authentic, true self, that core of who you are and what's inside you. So self-concordant goals are those that take us on the path where we actually do want to go Instead of the goals that we might set, the actions that we might take out of obligation because we should, we need to, we have to, right? Those are not paths that are going to help lead us to actualization, to flourishing. That external obligation leads us down a path where we're less consistent and we're less happy with the outcome. So, meaningful accomplishment, self concordant goals, and we got to have the resources to get the goals of the things that we actually want. And then we can feel a sense of accomplishment in a meaningful way. And that is a major pillar of the flourishing, the thriving, the well being equation that makes eudaimonia, that makes lasting happiness. And then the last big one in this whole kit is, are we caring for ourselves and those we love? Because if you listen to this show, that one of the major levers, not one, but many of the major levers that we can pull to increase the sensitivity to positive experiences, how we're actually taking care of yourselves. Are your foundational needs met? It's way easier to feel happier if you're consistently getting good sleep. You're going to be in a better mood. If you're eating nutritious food, you're going to have the energy to do all the things you want to do in your life. If you're moving your body, we already covered, you're more sensitive to positive emotional experience. So setting that foundation of nutrition, shelter, water, sleep, your mental health, the physical safety of your loved ones, all of that foundation of Maslow's hierarchy comes into play, because that's creating the foundation that we then build our other well-being upon. And that, I think, is a big one for all the wellness coaches out there who listen to the show. This is a huge part of the service that we provide, is help people figure out how to weave a lifestyle. And I think that lifestyle, when we get these factors that I'm talking about woven in a sustainable way, in practices, in belief systems, and values that are systems, not habits. I really want to highlight this. Habits are things we do automatically. But many of these practices are intentional choices that we're going to engage in a systemic way that we might not do automatically. Maybe you are like Dr. Seligman and you are a bit more negatively valenced in your disposition. Well, then it's going to be a choice for you to regularly practice gratitude, to regularly engage in exercise for mental health, to try to skew how you lean and get to a better place. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's not the same as a habit, right? If a habit's automatic. So building a system of lifestyle that keeps the checks and balances in place and continues to lift you up. And when that lifestyle is in place, where you get to show up as who you authentically are, contributing to the things that matter to you most, connecting in meaningful ways with others that you support, that support you, and it matters to you at a deep and fundamental level, that's eudaimonia. That's thriving and flourishing, which is a lot. That's a lot. And I want to throw out there, it's not that you don't have bad days anymore. It's inevitable. We all have challenges, but the bad days are part of a whole that fulfills you. The bad days have meaning too, because the things that are important enough to affect you in that way, they matter enough that you feel that heaviness, right? It's because you know who you are, you know what you value. The bad days are still going to come. Now, building it all, it's the process of building it, I think, brings many meanings and rewards. That's how we find accomplishment. That's how we find meaning, is being on that path. Whether you call it a wellness journey or a well-being journey, or you just call it life and living, it is that process of figuring it all out that can be so rich and deep and bring so much value into our lives. And that's really what positive psychology is all about. It's a journey. Life and living is a process, but one that I'm excited to be on in my own life, and also excited that I get to have a peek into your life, whether it's you listening to the show or the clients that I help and support on this journey itself. I would love to hear any feedback you have on this or any episode, or if you have episode suggestions, do not hesitate to reach out and let me know. You can send me an email. It's info@darlene.coach. On Instagram, I'm also Darlene.coach. I'm on TikTok now, Coach Dar, or you can find me on LinkedIn. If you're a fan of the show, I hope that you've subscribed. And even if you haven't left us a review, please go and do that because that helps us game the suggestion algorithm. Share it, tag us, write a review, let us know. And of course, be well and maybe even thrive in your own life. And take good care.